Chapter 3. The sounds of Knox stirring and the feeling of being in a foreign bed snapped Steele from his sleep. But despite the start he remained in bed, lingering on the edge of sleep in wakefulness, and deciding to let Knox head off to work without having to put on a cheery morning greeting. Slowly he opened his eyes to stare at the ceiling as he listened to Knox quietly come from his room and move to the kitchen. The walls of the apartment were thin, and he could hear the sounds of a pen scribbling on a piece of paper and the gentle clink of metal on the ceramic bench top. The pen stopped writing, and the door of the apartment opened before softly closing. Steele sat up then, yawning wide and scratching his head. It was early. By his estimations, the sun was just peeking over the eastern horizon and reaching through the tall buildings of Eden like rays through the trees of a dark wood. No morning light came through the sliding doors of the balcony, though, for another tall building blocked the sunrise. Standing, he opened the glass doors and stepped onto the narrow balcony, looking to the south through the gap in the buildings and the shimmering waves of the beach. Further to the south, the mainland could be seen, its towers glowing in the sunrise through the haze of the smog. The thin channel between Eden and the mainland was filled with boats already, many of them fishing vessels sailing from East Point docks out of the open ocean to the west. As the morning grew brighter, Steele noticed other residents stepping out onto the balconies to breathe the air of the morning. Those he noticed were still wearing their pajamas, or simply their underwear, unfazed that they were exposing themselves to everyone else. Steele cringed and looked away as an overweight couple stepped out onto the balcony wearing nothing but their skin. The sight had ruined the morning for him, and he headed back inside to his room, closing the door behind him. Moving from the bedroom, he stopped where the hall opened into the kitchen and living space, his eyes drifting about the room. It seemed so quiet and still, empty of life. The sounds from next-door neighbours getting ready and the movement of the lifts hummed through the walls like a lonesome tune, making him wonder once again as to what he was doing. Taking a deep breath, he absently moved across the tiles to the kitchen bench where he read the note Knox had left. Beside the message were spare keys to the building apartment, and on the paper was a brief note on how to use them, along with some cash Knox had left for him. Leaving the keys, note, and money where they were, Steele wandered around the bench and into the small galley kitchen and had a look in the refrigerator. The sight caught him by surprise, for the shelves were virtually empty, with only a couple of litres of bottled water in the door. A slight frown came to his face. He checked the freezer to see it was just as barren as the fridge. Closing the doors, he turned and looked through the pantry. Again there was nothing. Not even a few cans of food or long-life milk. Continuing his searching, Steele was no less perplexed to see all the glasses and crockery looked as if they were never used, and the dishwasher was empty and looked like it had not been used for a long time. His curiosity moved him into the bathroom and utility room, and he looked through the cupboards. At least here, there was something that suggested someone was living in the flat. The washing powder was open, and the cleaning lotions looked like they were being used. He was about to push through into Knox's room to have a closer look, but stopped himself, and returned to the main room where he sat down on the couch. He had barely sat down before he got back up, and returned to his room to dress before heading for the exit, grabbing the keys as he passed. Locking the door, he moved to the elevators and rode them to the ground floor. The lobby was empty, and he slowly walked out the building into the streets of Eden. The noise of the traffic greeted him abruptly, and he slipped into the mass of people walking briskly off to work. With no direction in mind, he moved with the flow towards East Point Central Business District, near the night markets, to a place called the 500 Blocks. The sounds of car engines, walking feet, murmuring voices and horns filled the growing morning that was slowly lighting up the shadows between the buildings and turning the day hot. He stopped at an intersection, halted by the traffic lights like everyone else walking the footpath. A few pedestrians took their chances at crossing the road between the cars, likely already running late for their work. The thought made him scoff and shake his head slightly. Were they so eager to try and impress the boss that they could just be overlooked for wage raise or promotion? The lights were taking their time in changing, so he looked about the shops and buildings around him, glancing over his shoulder and locking eyes at the middle-aged man who seemed to be paying too much attention to him. The man looked away quickly, flummoxed, and Steele guessed as to the reason. Detective Reeves said he was watching Knox, so it was only reasonable that the good detective had one of his men follow him as well. It was odd to think that Reed did not have anything better to warrant his attention, but still dismissed the follower from his concerns and crossed the road with the rest of the crowd. Could there be something else happening that he was not aware of? Something that Knox was tied up in? The question gave him brief pause. He was not all surprised at the thought of Knox being involved with something illicit, but he had no desire to be involved as well. It might be entertaining, though, he thought. Turning from the main footpath, he headed down a familiar alleyway, used by the locals as a shortcut between two large thoroughfares. The tailing police officer did not follow, and only a few people were taking the path from the main road. Shortcuts were known as hangouts for gangs and other unsavoury individuals, so only the desperate or uncaring took these alleyways. The reason most folk avoided the place became apparent around the corner, where Steele almost bumped into a group of 5 thugs, beating up a man against the wall. "Help me!" the poor man cried out desperately, as they all paused for half a second to notice Steele. "Please, oh, shut it!" The thug, doing most of the beating, snapped, punching the victim in the gut. "You want to be a hero?" One of the other gang members stepped in front of Steele and sneered, his bare arms covered in tattoos. Steele stopped walking, regarding the thug in front of him seriously. "You're in my way," Steele said simply to the man blocking his path. "Cocky prick, ain't ya?" sneered one of the others, coming to stand beside his tattooed friend. "Turn around and get the hell out of here before we beat the piss out of you." Steele did not reply, as he turned his hard eyes towards the other thug. "Go on," snapped the tattooed one, his eyes wide, trying to intimidate Steele. "Scared stiff, are ya? How about you're in my way?" Steele said, interrupting the thug and causing the man's face to go red with anger. With a roar of outrage, the tattooed gangster lunged at him, and his friends were quick to join in, but they did not know who they were dealing with. Steele had stopped his martial arts training, and although he was out of practice when it came to a real fight, his reflexes and instincts were still working at a high degree. The 5 gangsters stood little chance. The apparent leader of the group had some skill in fighting, but his technique was poor, with too much focus on trying to overwhelm Steele with pure strength. The fight was over in less than a minute, and Steele continued on his way with no regard for the poor man that the thugs had been assaulting. "Thank you," the man called after him. "I can't believe you. Hey, wait a minute." Steele did not stop or heed the man's words, and the man stopped trying, probably thinking it was best to leave the area before the gangsters got back up. Out from the alleyway, Steele joined on one of the main roads filled with foot traffic. The hour was past 9 o'clock, and all the people racing to work had gone, but it had not lessened the amount of pedestrians wandering about. Before he realised, he was crossing the main road and walking the framed stairs that led into the night markets of East Point. Although known for their nightly entertainment, the markets were as busy during the day, with hundreds of food stalls and shop fronts positioned in the huge rectangular cul-de-sac. The main road of the markets was only for pedestrians, and they followed the perimeter of the cul-de-sac, with shops on both sides. Many smaller roads twisted through the middle of the rectangular area. Moving through the buildings and past the cafes and restaurants, there was more than one level in the night markets, and footbridges stretched between the buildings on either side, and the underside of bridges were decorated with hanging lanterns and bunting. Small decorations were strung all about the markets, between the cultivated trees and maintained garden strips. In one corner of the market was a famous wishing well, a large fountain with a central statue of a dragon. The people, mainly tourists, would toss a coin into the water and make a wish, as was the custom. One of the more ridiculous customs to Steele's mind. But the fountain was impressive, he thought, as he walked by it, absently watching a pair of schoolgirls laugh as they tossed in a few coins. With no direction in mind, he continued wandering about the night markets, stopping to look at whatever caught his eye, but never buying despite the aggressive selling techniques the vendors were using. It was all about show here in the markets, all glamour and counterfeit brand goods for a cheap price. The shops looked clean and the restaurants a delight to dine at. It was all designed to draw in the tourists. The truth of the night markets was that it was entirely run by the company. All the locals knew it, including the police. But because everything looked legitimate, and in many cases was legitimate, there could never be any charges made. Steele recalled many times the police had raided the markets and hoped to catch them illegal dealings or activity, On those occasions, a few small-time dealers had been arrested, but no connection had ever been made to the company. Buying some cheap lunch, Steele watched as a pair of thugs extorted a store owner nearby, demanding the rent for the month. No doubt it was a large sum, but the owner was clearly used to it and begrudgingly handed over the money. This is part of the reason why the police had never been able to connect the company to illegal activities in the markets. The shop owners paid the legitimate rent to the corporations that owned the buildings, as well as being forced to pay the extortion money, or protection money, as the gangsters like to call it. The catch was that the company legally owned the buildings the shop owners were paying rent for, as well as being the ones behind the collection of the protection money. The police could never connect the corporations that owned the property to the company, and trying to follow the extortion money would never lead to the company either. This arrangement was most obvious here in East Point, and places like Barakatan, but in other places of Eden it was even harder to see causal links between the criminal activity and the company. Eating his disappointed meal as he walked, Steele found himself wandering back to the entrance of the night market, cutting through the narrow alleyways at the centre of the cul-de-sac and past all the shadier establishments. Along the narrow roads at street level were dim tattoo parlours and massage salons that doubled as whorehouses and strip clubs, with girls in skimpy outfits standing at the entrance to entice those walking by. A few of the door girls called out to him provocatively, their eyes vacant and bloodshot, but he ignored them and continued past. Glancing up to the walkways and bridges on the second level, it was odd to think that just up a flight of stairs was where the friendlier shops and cafes were situated. From the narrow roads you walked back through the arched entrance to the cul-de-sac and down the wide stairs towards the road. The sight of a group of people in suits caught his eyes as they stood in front of cars as if waiting for someone. This lot were the company men and women, that was obvious. And as Steele reached the bottom of the stairs, he drew the attention of all in the gang. He turned and continued along the sidewalk, but a pair of suited men blocked his path, their expression grave. "Get in the car," one of the men said seriously, motioning to the vehicle parked in the bus stopping zone nearby. Steele glanced at the car as another of the group opened the door, but he made no moves to comply. "Ours is not a request," the man said again, his tone unchanging as he opened his jacket slightly to show Steele the handle of a holstered gun. This group were indeed from the company, so it was likely that the pistol was real. Honestly, Steele could care less about the gun or their demand, but he found himself slightly curious. Without a word, he slowly turned from the pair blocking his path and walked over to the car to get in, sitting down in the back seat. It was a nice car, in fact, better than Knox's ride, with leather seats and tinted windows. The cabin was filled with the smell of smoked whiskey and sharp cologne, along with hints of hot chips from a fast food shop. At the other side of the back seat was a man waiting for him, grabbing Steele's attention as soon as he climbed into the car. Before any words could be spoken, though, the door was closed and the driver took off. Casually, Steele glanced about the back seat, noticing rich finish inside and a decanter of alcohol in the holder that extended from the center console. Still no words were spoken as Steele turned his eyes towards the man in the seat. Whoever he was, he looked to be nearing his late 30s, clean-shaven, with a neat haircut that was starting to show specks of grey. The man was slightly overweight, wearing a brand-name suit that was not tailored. An expensive watch was on his wrist, and he wore several fancy rings on his fingers. From his jacket pocket, the man took out a cigar and put it to his nose to sniff the smell of the tobacco. "I love that smell," the man remarked, holding the cigar before him in admiration. "That mixture of spice and wood makes my mouth water and the little hairs on the back of my neck tingle. This cigar is a classic Lonsdale, hand-rolled from Blanca and the Reef, banned by Eden's customs, of course. It will take a full hour and a half to burn." Steele did not say anything, and the man took out a cigar cutter to snip the end of his Lonsdale, before putting it in his mouth and lighting it up with a hot flame lighter. The man puffed a dozen times, overheating the tobacco, but he did not seem to notice. "Beautiful," the man sighed, blowing a thick cloud into the cabin. "The taste of the coffee and caramel dance on the palate. Do you smoke, Reinhardt Steele?" "No." "A drink, perhaps?" The man motioned to the decanter. "No." Taking another puff of his cigar, the man chuckled before taking a few bits of tobacco from his tongue and lip. "I suppose you're wondering who I am?" "Not really," Steele shrugged, turning his gaze out the window into the city as it passed by the window. "You're a company man. Associate, most likely. Good guess, the man chuckled again. My name is Jimmy Pierce. I take it you've heard of me. Steele shrugged again and looked back to the gangster, his eyes narrowing slightly. I report directly to Benedict Vandemont. I trust you know him. Again Steele did not reply, and he noticed Jimmy's eyes twitch slightly in annoyance. You know, I have this story I want to share. Jimmy looked away and took another drag of his cigar. There's no need, Steele cut in. Shut up and listen, Jimmy snapped, irritably, before he calmed himself with a steadying breath. Steele hid his smile well. This story, right, Jimmy continued. I was sitting in my office, enjoying my breakfast and reading the newspaper. I prefer the paper, you see. The television annoys the hell out of me. I had my favorite girl giving me a morning blowjob when my idiot brother comes bursting in. You remember Frankie, right? You two were in the same grade at high school. You broke his arm for picking on that wanker Knox. Jimmy turned a serious eye towards him, as if trying to impose some threatening mood. Steele barely noticed the glare and remained quiet, waiting for the man to continue. Anyway, Jimmy continued, sucking on his cigar again. Frankie burst in, ruining the blowjob, wailing and complaining about some prick bashing up his boys on my turf. The guy's a pain in the ass, but he's my brother, so what can I do? I says, Frankie, I'll handle it. So I downloaded the surveillance footage of the area where his boys were beaten up. I found a good angle of this guy taking out all 5 of them with his bare hands. Steele clenched his jaw and looked away without saying anything. Well, who the hell is this bastard? Was my first thought, Jimmy continued. But we at the company have access to police databases and whatnot. I won't bore you with the technical stuff. But we identified the prick as none other than Reinhard Steele. Steele looked back to Jimmy, noticing a confident smirk on his face. Now, normally, I don't care about little things like that, Jimmy continued, his tone becoming serious. But my kid brother really does hate your guts. So what? You gonna bash me up now because your brother came crying to you? Steele asked, though he did not believe that was the reason he was talking to Jimmy the Blade Pierce. That ain't it, Jimmy shook his head. The problem is Maxie, one of the guys you sent to the hospital. He was supposed to be joining me on a deal tomorrow night. Maxie is a good fighter, you see, but you're better, so you'll be replacing him. No, Steele said flatly, bringing a hard look to Jimmy's face. Slowly the associate from the company reached inside his suit jacket and took out a pistol, calmly holding it at his thigh. It was not a question, Jimmy said very seriously. You be ready to come with us tomorrow night, or I will kill you. Steele narrowed his eyes slightly. There was clearly more to this than Jimmy was saying. Perhaps Maxie's fighting ability had something to do with the deal, or maybe it was something else related to Steele personally. He could not be sure as to the real reason, but Jimmy's threat was real enough. Hey, it ain't all bad, Jimmy said, his expression becoming brighter. I'll pay you just as Maxie was going to get paid. I get it, Steele said, coming to the realization. This is your way of trying to recruit me to your gang. No, Jimmy replied swiftly, the hand holding his gun twitching slightly. This is me saying that if you don't join, I'll kill you. Cut the crap, Jimmy, Steele said seriously. You said yourself you looked at my police records and that you know of my history with your brother. If this was blackmail, you'd never have offered to pay me. But if we're leaving out all the crap, how about I save us all the aggravation except your kind and polite offer? I need the money, so you'd better pay me well. I'll make one thing very clear, though. If this deal involves anything I don't like, I'm walking out. Your death threats be damned. Jimmy was quiet. His dark eyes were guiding Steele closely as his hand held tight to his pistol. Slowly a smile came to his face, and he returned the handgun under his jacket. I know what happened to your sister, and how you responded, Jimmy said, his tone seeming to suggest it was some great secret. I'm not as stupid as my kid brother. I know your worth, Steele. The comment brought a slight frown to Steele's face, and Jimmy smirked. Pablo, pull over here, Jimmy said to the driver, and the man stopped along the sidewalk. Your new phone, Steele. I'll be in touch. The man handed him a mobile phone, one that had only recently been released by the largest phone company in Eden. Without a word, Steele took the device and climbed out of the car, to find that he was at one of the other entrances to the night market. They had, in fact, been driving around in circles the whole time. Closing the car door, emerged back into the traffic, and Steele breathed a heavy sigh, a frown on his face. He had not intended to work with the company on his return to Eden, but he did need the money. Although he was not concerned with being involved with illegal dealings, what the actual deal might involve did give him some pause for thought. What mattered now, though, was finding enough money so he would not have to rely on Knox for support. Knox had enough to deal with without him leeching off him, and trying to find a legitimate job in a city where unemployment rate was over 10% was virtually impossible. Taking a deep breath, Steele slipped his new phone into his pocket and started on his way back to the apartment. He had never intended to work for gangsters, but in retrospect, somehow he always knew that this was how it was going to end up. His thoughts returned to Reeves and the offer the detective had put before him. Likely the old police officer saw the same thing happening. Steele glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting about the crowds in search of one of Reeves' men following him, but saw no one obvious. Did Jimmy know he was being watched by the police? It was unlikely that he did, otherwise Jimmy would never have tried to force him to join his arm of the company. It was his first day back in the city, and already so much had happened. There was a lot to think about. And Steele spent the rest of the afternoon lying on the couch, pondering his predicament as he stared at the ceiling.